It's like what they call in Australian the triple whammy, isn't it? Where we've actually got transformational changes happening, high degree of complexity in what we're doing, and lots of increased workload and stress. So I think the aspect of resilience at work has very much come out of that need. So organisations are saying, what do we need to do to build resilience? But one of the other emerging trends that's happened, and Jason and I have had quite a few conversations about this today, is that there is quite a lot of work happening at the organisational level at the moment, which is a lot about risk management, disaster recovery. What do we do as an organisation to prepare for or respond to disruption and change? And at the other end is the psychology headset, which is where my headset is around what do we need to do from a personal level. So we were looking at how do we actually combine what seems to be quite two very different aspects, looking at resilience, to bring together a session today that looks at both what we need to do organisationally and what we actually need to do in terms of our teams. And this is a fabulous framework from the Rockefeller Foundation. They have a program which you may be familiar with called the 100 Resilient Cities program. And they've got cities from across the world who are looking at building resiliency. And Adelaide's not one of them yet, but we certainly have one in Sydney, and which Jason's been involved in, and in Melbourne as well. And what appeals in this framework is that it talks about 7 principles that guide resilience. So we're going to connect both our sessions coming from quite different viewpoints today around some of the fundamental principles that create resilience within our organisations. So Jason's going to talk for a start. We'll do a little bit of activity, and then I'll talk and we'll do a little bit of activity. So it will be interactive, and we'll leave some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. But I'd now like to introduce Jason Gottschalk to the stage to talk about his part. And I'll need to go down this end as well. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here today. It's lovely to see you all. And thanks, really, a big thanks for coming all the way down from Sydney. It is a very competitive stream today, and if I would probably be next door myself, so I do appreciate you coming. So what I am going to talk today about, as Kath alluded to, just a quick hands up, who's, other than a football game or for a parents' meeting, who's actually heard about resilience? Who's heard the word this year? Okay, so it's probably about 80%. Who's got an understanding of what they think it is? Yep. Who's got no idea what it is? Okay, so that tells us a lot. I don't think anyone put their hand up for no idea. So that tells us that it is a concept that's embedded amongst the world, in human nature, in psychology, in families, in sporting teams. I live resilience 24/7 pretty much to my wife's disdain. And even on the weekends I struggle to shut down from it, because I do find it's an element that actually sits in our life right across a multitude of areas. But even as someone in a resilience field and a position, I get a little bit of resilience fatigue as well. So that is something that we're trying to fight as a new emerging sort of industry as well, around trying to get people to sort of think about it as a holistic approach. So mine's not as exciting as Kath, and I'll tell you straight up front about that, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of the bread and butter stuff that makes up resilience. So I'll try to make it attractive, but I really like what Kath talks about, because she approaches it from a psychological point, which is also the area that really where it needs to be embedded, and that's with top leadership, but that also pertains to organisational culture, and that's really, as you would all guess already, is where it really needs to sit. The stuff that I'm going to show you now is relates to how we're going to get that culture to actually do something, and even how we're able to relate back to some sort of KPIs within an organisation. Because again, what you will find with resilience, the more that you explore it, it can be a very much a touchy-feely type of subject. And certainly I've got friends who have had to sit in front of boards and CEOs, and the board has actually struggled to understand the concept, because there's nothing they could actually put their fingers and hands on. So this is a really boring standard definition of what resilience is. So I don't read that out to you, as in most PowerPoints we can all read ourselves. This basically is against disruption. So what we're trying to do is build resilience so that whatever disrupts our business, our life, our organisation, our culture, we have a better response to respond to that. And the old idea was that we bounce back. the resilience sort of buzzword is that we would bounce forward. Now that is obviously a lot easier said than done. Most organisations will struggle to come back. And some really good case studies of this in recent years were around the Christchurch earthquakes. And even only 2 weeks ago I was in Wellington and met with a lot of people that were in those earthquakes. And there's some statistics floating around that you can find. But I was getting on the ground information from people telling me that their businesses basically completely collapsed after the earthquake. And a lot of the measures that they thought they had in place, including risk management, just didn't work for them. So it's a bit of a 101, but I'm not going to spend too much time like a school teacher. I want us to get across the principles fairly quickly. So resilience, hard and fast, is basically made up of two halves. So there's these, what we call the disciplines. So all of those you'd be fairly familiar with. Most organisations, you've already got those in play. Now, what I often say, and please, I don't mean to offend anyone, I've got some good risk management colleagues in the audience. These are not the sexy parts of the business. They're the bread and butter part that keep things going each day. Facilities, for argument's sake, of course. The lights go out, the aircon, the car park, access control. Those areas aren't exciting, but without facilities management functioning at a high level, most organisations shut down very quickly. Certainly public buildings, the chilling towers go down within about 8 to 10 minutes with 200 people on the floor. It's 30, 31, 32 degrees. So these sort of things are happening now. They're getting done in the background. They keep organisations going. What resilience is currently doing in relation to these disciplines, it's challenging those, because for at least the last 30 to 50 years, a lot of organisations have thought because they've got those in place, no matter what occurs, we're going to survive and we're going to push forward, and these people, they're going to control all that for us. So this has been a little bit of an eye-opener with resilience, because people have gone through disruption, they've had a major crisis, and we've all seen those. I've got a couple of case studies for you, but you've all seen those, from Malaysian Airlines to the Sony hack. There's organisations that thought they would respond really well to disruption who completely failed. So they're the hard and fast of the stuff that keeps things moving. The principles are based around things that I would like to believe are happening today in every organisation and being adhered to and being spread and growing your organisational culture. How many people just off that list, hands up, think that their organisations, you don't have to obviously name it, are doing a good job at all those? Okay, so that's another 0 out of 10. So that's not uncommon. Most organisations, anyone see the Alderman Trust Barometer? That came out, a new survey last year. Organisations are not only being trusted, there's actually no belief in those organisations they're doing a good job for either their customers, their clients, or for their employees. So organisations are not only failing us, but they're also failing themselves a little bit. So a lot of those, and we'll tie those in a little bit later as to how we can improve on those. But those things there are essentially what you could go back 50, 70 years to organisations that were being built then, and sometimes I call it the Pleasantville. Has anyone seen Pleasantville? It's a great movie if you want to watch it. It's more exciting than any of my presentations, but it's a good feel movie. What it shows you is America in the 1950s, where everything was perfect, and we know in the world that's never been a reality, but organisations were kind of similar to that at one stage. They were places where everything did work quite well. You knew who worked in another division. You didn't just have morning teas that were sponsored around something, but you talked to people. You knew what their jobs were. This came out from the Economist Business Intelligence Unit about 6 months ago, and this is a fairly telling statistic on where organisations think that resilience should be built. So this was a survey of 250 Fortune 500 companies, top CEOs, executive leaders from Microsoft to Coca-Cola, right across the board, and they basically said, as in, we probably could have changed the title here to say, who do you think replenishment for the coffee is? And the CEO still would have ended up with that. So we put a lot of pressure on the CEO and the COO and the CFO to drive our organisation, to make it resilient, to ensure that we've got a future, not to run into disruption, to make sure that our job is there in a year or 2 or 5 years. So the pressure is on for that to happen. I'm not so sure in even my consultancy role these days how much that actually happens, and I certainly saw it in some embedded roles. You can see down that list, it kind of cascades down from no single unit, so really that's saying we've got no idea. C-level, which is another great word that I'm sure everybody likes as much as I do, gets thrown around a lot. It doesn't always get to do a lot in some cases. Business operating units, and these can fall into risk management, business continuity, disaster recovery. So that's a bit of a where the world thinks it was, and that was published around, like I said, 6 months ago, and that formed a lot of the current opinion that's happening around resilience, because it really was a bit of a wake-up call. I've got a couple of quick, Coles plain brand case studies for you. They're both on my own experience, and I'm certainly aware of being any liability around the companies. So this story is around leadership. This is a shopping centre. I won't name it, but it's the largest retail shopping centre in the world. So this company I was working there in a reasonably senior role, went through a massive change management program. And again, I think when it was, Kath brought it up, and it was brought up earlier today, when we said change management, it's a little bit like a bit of a, someone says that maybe Essendon's going to win the premiership this year. The hardcore people don't laugh, but everyone else laughs. So I think a lot of organisations, they talk about these things, but they don't actually get anywhere with them. So this organisation decided to split the company completely into two halves. And what it did was it branded one under a separate name, and then continued to obviously brand under another name. So this was an organisation that is massive. We all know who it is. It was doing incredibly well. At that point in time, they put in a change management plan around retaining staff, around moving into new markets, around changing roles, and the 6,000 or 7,000 people that work in that $70 billion company. At no time did anyone feel as if they were going to lose their job, or they were going to be made redundant. And even the people that were actually offered redundancies, or their roles completely changed, they were actually happy about it. And from the inside, and as a case study nationally within Australia at the moment, this company is pioneering in the way that it actually does the introduction of new ideas. And its organisational culture is certainly the strongest that I've ever felt in my career, in the fact that it gives you information constantly. And the tone from the top, management buy-in, CEO sort of loyalty to the business is at absolute paramount. So even in my role, my division changed dramatically right across the board, and I worked within about a $150 million portfolio. Nothing changed in that. In fact, it looked like it changed quite dramatically. It actually went to about a $220 million portfolio, and we incorporated a whole section of other businesses within the area that I worked in. So it was all positive the entire time. To give you a flip side of the story, again, an unnamed company that I did recently work at, so I like to use my own experience, but I also don't like to go to court. So I'll let you guess as to who that might be. So this company is being used a lot at the moment for the big disruption, and I don't know about you, but disruption, agile, innovation, no offence to today's theme, and resilience probably, I think, made the mark this year for the most overused words this year. Certainly, this company did not see disruption coming. It did not see the market changing. It did not see its customer base starting to diminish. It really prided itself on having a really successful history of doing exactly the same thing. So this company is embarking on a massive change management program at the moment, an integration program. They're looking at, they've got a suite of redundancies. They've got some new people they've brought in internationally that are sort of propping things up. At the same time, they're not feeding back information to employees. Nobody's really got any idea. There was a number of major announcements this year that everyone in the company heard when it hit the Sydney Morning Herald that morning. So nobody knew about it. There's all sorts of silos that have been created, and they've been there for over 20 years. So in my own position in terms of my resilience journey and some of the stuff that I work on in industry, think tanks and that sort of stuff, I do use that personal experience not to put a slant either in a good way or a bad way on either of those companies, because they are, at the heart of it, still two very, very good companies for a number of reasons. But for me personally, they're absolutely indicative of a company that had a really good degree of resilience and a company that had no idea what resilience was, and how one company could certainly be a company that would be a case study in the future for university students to go, here's our pioneering, and the other one would be Kodak Mark II, because we all know what happened to Kodak, but nobody at Kodak knew that. So who's familiar with this? This is the Daiichi nuclear plant, Fukushima, 2011. Everybody's seen that? So I use this as an example because that was where the world focused its attention on that power plant. That power plant was completely devastated. And at the time, it was just blamed completely, of course, on the environment and on those massive, enormous factors, one of a Richter scale of 9, one of the worst ever catastrophes in the world. But what this did do is all of the energy was on that in terms of the media scrutiny. The company had a number of failings in its divisions. There's some subsectors that I'll go into in the next slide. The culture was really, really poor. The communication levels were poor. Things like this dream state of CEO and C-level buy-in was non-existent. They had all sorts of infrastructural problems. They had management programs that facilities weren't being budgeted for. There was a number of issues. Now, this one was completely devastated. Just down the road, 9 kilometres away, was the Daini nuclear plant. Has anyone heard of that? Put your hand up if you have. Yep. So few people. So don't trump me on the case study if you know more than I do. But this case never gets talked about. This was only 9 kilometres away, same tidal waves, same infrastructure, similar losses in certain parts of the plant. But they had an engineering leader there by the name of Masuda, who has just been put in charge in recent time of the redevelopment of this plant. So at the time, this one suffered something like 85% collapse across the plant for a multitude of reasons. This plant here was almost untouched other than flooding. The nuclear reactors were still flooded, but they had crisis management plans in place for that. They had rehearsed their emergency management plans. Everybody was familiar with hierarchy lists, with contact charts. They knew what to do in the case of a massive emergency was to occur at that organisation. So they were able then to put all those things that they had built in pure capability and turn those into an actionable event, so that when this once-in-a-lifetime disruption occurred, these people went like clockwork and had synergies amongst their team. So they didn't meet people for the first time in the most devastating and exciting, tragic part of their entire careers. So it's quite often, it's a funny case because a lot of people have actually never heard of the second plant because the media didn't give it a lot of attention at the time. In resilient circles, it's pioneering as a case study in terms that it shows that if you actually look at least to achieve some sort of resilience within your organisation, there's a very good chance that you can actually have a good outcome. So that's the theoretical part. So really, that's talking about hard and fast stuff which we can put our hands on, so they're the physical parts that keep the organisational going at any one time. And then there's a holistic part as well. So I'm going to just put these round to the tables. Kath, would you mind putting those on, just one on each? Thank you. So we used this first time last year at the business continuity exercise, and I've used it for a couple since. What this does, what it really shows is it can, without preempting and ruining it for us, it's not that exciting, I must say as well. So without preempting it too much, what it can show is it'll show a different viewpoint on where you think your organisation should recover from and where its current strengths are. So quite often when I first did this at a business continuity forum, business continuity came at the top, and everything to do with that, from your second cousin to somebody you once knew who even knew what business continuity was, all got a flavour, and they all got a seat at the table. Another organisation, we looked at that table, and it was all risk management. Someone else, it was all facilities. I said, what about your risk management department? Oh, we just stand them down. I said, okay, well, that's probably not going to work. Someone else said, well, I'd stand up sales and marketing because we need to get a media campaign going for social media. I said, okay, but you've got no facilities, so the building's shut down and there's no IT infrastructure. So what I would like you to do is go through those attributes there. There should be one for every table. Have we got one for every table? Sorry, my mistake. So we need one for each table, one of those for each table. There's about 20 attributes on there that I'd like you to just discuss at your table. Some of them are the disciplines, some of them are the attributes and principles. As a group, you can use one of your own companies in a hypothetical fashion. You could use Coca-Cola, you could use the AFL, whatever you like. But what I'd like to do, and I hope we'll get some synergy, but we'll also get some differences as well, is to go through on the butcher paper for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll quickly discuss it on what do you think are the most important ones. You may go 1 to 20. You may think that it's only 1 to 4, so those 4 things. This is in a major disruption of some sort. Now that could be a reputational, it could be an airline crash, it could be something like the Sony hacking scandal or the current VW crisis. So if you can discuss that as a group for us, then we'll pick a few tables to sort of see how much synergy we can actually create between us. Okay. I was about to say guys, but anyone that read David Morrison's piece this week about using guys, I'm not using guys anymore. I'm going to go with it. Did anyone read that? It's another cultural piece. David Morrison, the ex-general of the army. There was a lot of stuff about using the word guys. Did anyone read that? I actually didn't mind it. I actually agree with it. I was just about to say, okay, guys, but I think it could be quite offensive. So I think some political correctness is good, some's bad. Has everyone had to think about that? Happy to give some results? So what I will say, and this is not just a catchy byword because everyone says it, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just your thoughts on how this might work. Table 1. Kim, thanks. So you're going to get the mic just like we have to?
Well, yes.
All I really wanted, we went around to a few tables, but the key is whether you could say, well, I need all 40 of those to have a resilient organisation, you'd be exactly right. In a smaller, if it's a car yard and there's only 7 employees, they're not going to have a risk management division, but they still might have someone who does some risk management. So you could have 2 or 3, you could have 10. Thanks.
Well, we didn't debate enough probably, and so we all had different opinions, and initially we were kind of talking about it after a crisis rather than before.
Yep.
But I have the microphone, so I'm going to say my opinion.
Oh, right, okay. And Kim got me to this event, so I'm just going to agree with her anyway.
I would say culture, so human resources, and we saw risk management as sitting above everything in that list.
What a surprise.
Yeah, I'm in risk management, so. Yeah. So, but ultimately we think there are elements of that, and if we get that right, we get the philosophy right of resilience, then in a crisis we'll have the right response, we'll bounce forward rather than implementing lots of procedures. Yep. And slowing opportunities down.
Sure, no problem. And what about culture, the principle stuff? Did you have your human resources would be responsible for leading that piece, do you think?
Yes. Yeah, I think if we have good culture, we'll have good risk culture.
Sure.
It makes risk management much easier if you've got good people.
It does. Table 7.
Thank you. We decided to pick a large South Australian industry that has suffered disruption, that shall remain anonymous.
We'll look it up afterwards on Google.
Mm-hmm. There'll be one thing, if I do choose to say it, you'll work it out perhaps, but if I'm going to talk, I'll just start with disciplines first. We didn't cover them all in the time because for a while, we decided which corporation we'd pick.
Sure.
But if I can just isolate disciplines first, looking at our discussion, it has business continuity, finance, sales and marketing, and I've put in brackets HR. Business continuity, because there we spoke about the company really needed to have a strategy and a long-term vision so that it could know where it's going and be agile to respond to the information, which is where sales and marketing came in, because it's not just about selling the product, but there's market intelligence, knowing what the trends are and responding to that and having a strategy in place or a team in place or a R&D team or something that will be able to respond to new market needs and know where that information needs to go. Yes. We also put in finance as one of the disciplines, as I said, and that's because we thought in this case, and we don't know, we're making an assumption, that maybe as the parent company is an overseas company, maybe they're trying to put in place that company's vision of market expansion across the world, wherever, So they perhaps in their vision are removed from the local market conditions, and maybe that's one of the reasons that the information about local market trends and demand is not being fed back into the local business that is facing the serious disruption. And that even went to suppliers who were dependent on the larger corporation really for their own business activity, so they weren't communicating, they weren't diversifying, and they were dependent on a type of profit model, as was the larger company dependent on a type of monetary income, and also the lack of the ability to innovate. Even with HR though, about hiring the right people to do all of those things, so it's systems and people, it's not necessarily HR's fault, could be, but it's about talking to the leadership and leadership talking back, saying actually what we need is this.
We'll change the name to People and Culture.
Okay. And just in brackets on the side here, we've blamed a lot of people for not doing things.
Okay, perfect. All right, well that's very nicely done. And anyone who wants to work in consultancy from that table, just give me a call. That's outstanding. You guys have hit a number of marks there. Really good.
Oh, just wanted to know whether there was a surprise for noticing that trust was mentioned twice. Maybe
No. That's a lack of resilience in proofreading. Okay, we might skip a little bit because otherwise Kath will be throwing me off the stage. Let's do 8 and then we might do 5. No offence to the other tables. Or we'll skip across to 6 and if we can. Or if you wouldn't mind, we'll do all tables, but we'll just quickly skip through the top ones just so we can get to the... I don't want to step on Kath's toes too much.
Hi. Basically, around the room, around the table, we realised there were a number of people who work at the same place. Mm-hmm. So it was easy to focus on where they work.
Yep.
It's a health services area.
Yes.
So we looked at both lists and made priorities. To cut this short, or keep it short, it came down to the number one principle being leadership and the number one discipline being crisis management.
Yes.
And I think we could decide that would translate across a lot of different businesses.
Yes, yeah, well done.
That's kind of our contribution.
Yep. So the number one outcome, you're exactly correct, is leadership. It takes leadership at every level, plus at an organisational top level as well. Yep, well done. We'll quickly go to 9, then we can skip to 6, 5, 3. 9. 6.
We were from some large government departments, and we actually spent a little bit of time thinking that it's important to distinguish between, I guess, chronic disaster or something that's actually a bit more insidious,
yes,
and then also an acute disaster. And so for someone like me working in SA Health, where SA Health's actually leading major reform across the state around the health system, we were saying, well, you need a really strong purpose, you need leadership and information, and you need to keep stating why we're doing this, in the public domain as well as within the infrastructure of the department.
Yes.
Whereas if you're actually in an acute situation, health's always been good at managing medical disasters, it's something we're good at, so you actually need quite different skills for that kind of a scenario, but we were reflecting that often it's the insidious risks that actually, sneak up on you and
they
can
do. And in crisis
can do the
management,
most disaster.
Creeping crisis. Where they actually sit in the background. So most people, when the crisis occurs, they say, well, we actually knew about this for some time. So they just do sit in the background. Very well done. Table 9.
Hi. We talked a lot about the principles in terms of building organisational resilience, and talked about leadership at all levels through the organisation, including top management. And then we talked about agility and strategy, and the strategy would be about addressing all different types of scenarios, not just physical incidents, but there could be psychological incidents through rapid change in the organisation, and things like that.
The uncertainty.
Yep, and then under the strategy would come your business continuity, disaster recovery, crisis management, risk management. We saw them as being, rather than separate things, all part of a larger whole.
Yes, yep. Fantastic.
You can't really separate them out.
Another 10 out of 10 for that table, yep. So that's exactly how they are. They should be working in complete synergy. And you've hit a cornerstone that I bang on a lot about in the industry, and a lot of people do, is the strategy part. Because an organisation's strategic planning has to be thinking of resilience as well. So even when I was working recently at Foxtel, that was a conversation related to my case study. But when I worked there, I worked really closely with the head of strategy for the company, and he was really involved heavily with trying to build a resilience plan, which was really good. Because that's an avenue that the business listens to, right? No matter where you are in the organisation, when you come from strategy, you're setting forecasts, you're talking about budgeting, you're bringing in income. Great. 5. And as you can see already, just before we do the last 2 tables, all the tables are different. So none of them have been exactly the same, which tells us there's a lot of viewpoints on resilience. Thanks.
Just
Steve.
building on the last table's comments around business continuity, those set of documents or plans have it's a common truth across the organisation. So when you're involved in change, everyone, whatever department, can refer back to them. So that was one of the comments there. We then spent a lot of time on coherence, common vision, leadership, trust.
Yep.
I used an example of the move to Heathrow Terminal 5 as an example of massive breakdown of leadership and coherence in a failure of a large move like that, contrasted to Hong Kong Airport, where an entire airport moved overnight. So very big difference in that sort of coherence and common vision from all the people involved in those 2 different scenarios.
Yeah, but almost exactly the same project, right? Almost in a way, yeah.
Yeah, the larger one went better because they had better coherence and common vision.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Great, thank you. You hit all the marks there too. So the other thing while we go to table 3 is there's a lot of commonalities, but also, it's a cliche, but it is not rocket science. It's fairly easy to work out for an organisation on where this stuff actually sits. Thank you. Table 3.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. So we focused on leadership and trust during a crisis or disaster.
Nice. Yep.
And we sort of looked at the different phases and the different sort of strengths that you need to sort of keep in mind. So I guess the preparation before, so what structures I guess you already have in place.
Yes.
And then I guess leadership and trust strategy when a crisis does occur, and then maybe looking back just after the crisis is finished, or and seeing how, like, if it does happen again, how you would handle it, if you could handle it differently, and yeah.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you. So you can see already from those table discussions, there's quite a few different opinions. No table was exactly the same as the other. You had some commonalities amongst the disciplines and some commonalities amongst the principles. But really, and also we took a few different approaches. Some people were talking about pre-disruption in the normal BAU, business as usual environment. Others were talking about afterwards, thinking about what we could have done better. So there's a number of ways to hit resilience. I'm going to finish up with this list, which is not going to be unfamiliar to us now, because we've already, without me even showing you this, you've already worked it out for yourself. So the key element to resilience internationally, worldwide, from everyone who's even heard of it for 1 minute to spent 10 years on it, is that you need buy-in from the top level of the organisation. Now that's a tough area because everybody in the organisation is looking for the same thing. Sales, marketing looking for stuff, finance is looking for approval on budgets, facilities want new air conditioning for the building, security wants an upgrade in CCTV. It's a clouded, busy market trying to get the interest of organisations. But with resilience, if your organisation deems that it's not that important, you're going to run into real dramas. Silos. Who's known about silos for more than 5 years? Anyone? Yep. Did you know it was called silos 5 years ago? No, me either. So I talk about this every day of the week, right across the board with everyone. And a few years ago, I found the first book on silos. I'm reading a really good book at the moment called The Silo Effect, if you're ever bored at the airport. In fact, I bought it here at the airport in Adelaide about 8 weeks ago. It talks about the positivity of silos, in fact. So we're getting a bit of reverse again now. But silos, breaking down silos, become another bit of a cliche. Actuality, truth or dare, you can't have a resilience program if you've got silos built across the organisation. Or instead of having all vertical, they need to have some transparency horizontally across them. So at least you can still have people operating in very successful siloed parts of the business, but somebody has got to be able to, if they're speaking Japanese, everyone else is speaking Korean, somebody's got to be able to speak both. Cross-departmental communications, a fancy word for, hi, how you going? My name's Jason, I work in IT. Oh, where do you work? Oh, I'm in the marketing department. Organisations years ago, we all did this every day of the week. I try to encourage this in businesses that I've worked in where I have a morning tea. I used to run a warden program in a building. I go out, I spend the company's monies on $30 worth of muffins and some free coffee, and then I put an email out to everyone, hey, do you want muffins and free coffee? Everybody turns up. Oh, what's all this about? Actually, we're going to talk about warden training today. And everyone goes, oh, but you get a muffin, right? So, cross-departmental communication, you can do that a number of ways. This is a big one because nobody really in most organisations is honest with themselves. Who really wants to, actually we just had a nice conversation at table 3 about this, who wants to be completely honest? So even when people do their exit interviews, amazingly, the job that you couldn't stand the day before, you now say, oh, it's actually really good and I don't mind the culture here, and I'll put my hand on my heart, I did that myself. I recently moved from an embedded role to a consultancy that serviced the same embedded role I was in. I backfilled my position. The boss there is a good mate of mine. I didn't bag out the CEO and tell them that I thought he was a disaster. I said I didn't engage with his management leadership style. So we need to be honest. We need to start being honest, right? Supply chain. Somebody, I think table 7 brought up supply chain. It's one of the most important ones. People go, supply chain, yeah, I've heard of that. Okay, you know, some companies have got a single source supply chain. So you've got a part that runs your entire business, something in something like water. You might have a dam facility where it's got one single turbine that only comes from one part of the world. So those type of organisations make sure they've got multitude of suppliers right across the world that they can draw from. I worked at the US Embassy early 2000s in Canberra. We had the main gate of the embassy made in California, transported from California, serviced from California. So when it broke down, the gate shut for a week. And even the Prime Minister couldn't come in the front gate of the US Embassy. So single source breakdown is very common. Situational awareness, this is another one. Everyone knows what it is? And certainly if I can email these around to everyone, I haven't got any cards and I just changed jobs a week ago. So that's why there's a bit of confusion. But situational awareness is another one, falls into the cliche, repetitive, you start to switch off, yeah, I've got it, no problems. And then you walk across the road on your phone with the headphones and nearly get hit by a bus. I'm telling you, you've got no situational awareness. Most organisations, again, they talk about having this, and then when something happens, from executive down go, I can't believe that happened to us. Well, you obviously weren't aware of the situational stuff that's going on. Agility, innovation, strategy. Again, I often say to people, how are you doing with your innovation program that you're running? Really good. And in fact, this one's open in the media anyway. I've got a friend who runs a massive part of Telstra in innovation. She said to me, I won't name it, she said to me in the last 12 months they worked on this phenomenal looking product that's going to come out. It's an app of some sort. It's really good. I said, fantastic, how's it going? How's the rollout going? She goes, oh no, terrible. And I said, what's happening with it? She said, we've had to just hire a bunch of consultants to show us how to roll it out. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, no, we spent so much time working on the concept, nobody's actually worked where it's going to fit in the market, what are the competitors. So now they're on a massive campaign to hire consultants to actually get their own product out to market because they've got really no idea where it now sits because they were so focused on the product. So innovation is great. I love it. This conference is all about it. Agility is another one. I have hardly worked anywhere that's agile. And I've even got people now, project management people I know, who are telling me they're doing waterfall, then they're doing prints, then they're doing stuff, and now they're going to switch to agile. And I say, what does that mean here for you? And they say, oh, agile just means that we get it done really fast. Now, I don't think agile project management is just getting it done really fast. Strategy, we talked about briefly before. Capability. You need to build real capability if you want resilience. If you've just got this KPI that you tick off and it just sits there, or you can explain it to someone, capability is built through exercising, communication, testing, training, all those sorts of things in an organisation. I've got one more. This is probably the last one, which is dependencies and interdependencies, which is often talked about a lot in business continuity, in disaster recovery, in IT. IT, they talk about all the little sort of spaghetti type org charts that go out throughout an organisation. If you neglect those two and you have all the others, you're going to fall over anyway, because you might have the most resilient organisation that relies on something, you get all that fixed up, your supply chain fails and you don't look at other interdependencies, whether upstream or downstream they call them, where it either comes to you or you send it to someone else, they fail, you're in big trouble as well. That's it. Thank you very much for your time today, and I don't think we might do some questions at the end, so if you do have any. Oh yeah, if anyone's got any questions, happy to talk as you've seen today. No, it's all right if you don't have any. None?
Where would you see a statement about organisational resilience in the organisation, if in a policy or?
Yeah, I think so. Business continuity, risk management, appetite statements, they all sit at the top level. They need to be signed off by a CEO. So as an industry worldwide, and this is happening right across the world at the moment, all over the place, embedded roles and in consultant type roles, we're looking to try to build that engagement. That's part of the sort of job that I'm really heading up in the market with a number of groups, is to say, well, let's not scare people into wanting a resilience policy statement. Let's kind of say, well, this is what the alternative is if you don't take an interest in this. There's a lot of talk in the industry around chief risk officers, the CROs, which is a really well-known embedded role in a lot of organisations, taking on a lot of resilience duties as well. And often a company will have a risk management statement policy. So it needs to really be tied in with policy, because then you can push it back to your C-suite and you can also make the board responsible for it as well. If it's not a policy at that level, it'll be mixed up amongst all the profit-making parts of most organisations. So then it doesn't work. That's it. Any out? Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Thank you. What if it's not a profit-making organisation?
Yeah, no.
Same thing?
Yeah, same thing in principle. So resilience won't, there is some case studies already happening. In fact, Qantas is one of them. They put a really good program in about 5 years ago. Alan Joyce, I think, was the last CEO before the new one, came out at the end of that program and said that he thought he had saved them something like $50 million over the 5-year period, just having a resilience methodology. I work with a number of NGOs in my career and also privately at the moment. And I'm giving some advice to some of them. They're saying, well, we don't have any money. I said, you don't need any money. What we need is some buy-in. So if I can convince you that it's a really good idea, and then I spend an hour convincing you of the idea, and you say, well, what's the catch? How much is it going to cost me? What profit centres? I say it's free. You go, okay, what have I got to lose? Nothing. So resilience is essentially free. It's just building up the sort of networks within your own organisation. So it can cost money. If you want to hire someone to do a whole business continuity program, you either pay them a salary or you get a consultant to do it for you. So it can cost you money, but at the heart of it, it can be free, because it's a philosophy, it's a mindset that you need to try to get your organisation into. It's about the culture piece, which the first table I think talked about. Yeah, anyone else? No? Thank you very much.
So as I said at the beginning, we're looking at two sort of different directions that we're coming to the topic of resilience from. And so Jason's spoken very, very well about what we need to do organisationally in terms of our systems and processes and responses to the environment. My journey has very much come from working with people in the organisations that I consult with. So my journey in resilience started in about 2009, where when I went out to work with leaders and work with teams and organisations, they started to ask me, how do we build resilience? And I think it's one of those words where, as I said earlier, it's a small word, but a lot sits behind it. So, you know, I can tell whether you're resilient or whether you're not, but what do we need to do to actually be resilient was the question that I was asking. And so what we've done is we've been on a bit of a journey. So I need to go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, got the wrong slides up. So we've been on a bit of a journey of looking at what does a resilient workplace look like in terms of the people and the behaviour and what they actually do and their actions. Hang on, got all the wrong slides. I'll keep going. So when you actually look, so the first thing we actually did, I work a lot with the University of South Australia, and first thing we actually did was to look at what does the literature tell us. You know, so if we go out into the world of the peer review literature, if you like, that the academics work in, what actually is resilience when we're actually talking about the workplace? And what we actually found was most of the stuff out there was around community resilience, was around clinical resilience, and there wasn't an awful lot about what do we actually need to do as employees to build our resilience. And I think the other thing that has happened out of that is that because most of the literature was around clinical work and so on, what's happened is a lot of the offerings that we're getting in workplaces are rebadged work from the clinical space. So we get rebadged emotional intelligence and, you know, how we build resilience using emotional intelligence. We get rebadged psychological therapy, you know, so cognitive behavior therapy is the classic one where they've rebadged that and they're giving people actually exercises in stoicism and resilient thinking. But if we go back to why resilience is actually important in organisations, it's because people want strategies to manage the busyness. They want strategies to manage the stress, and they actually want strategies to manage the changes that are going on. And I do need my slides up. Oh, here we go, we've got them now. So what we found was that a lot of the answers that were being produced in resilience space weren't actually looking at what people were looking for, because when we're talking about resilience at work, we're talking about how do we actually sustain people's performance at an optimal level without burning them out. And so trying to put this in the well-being space is actually not the space it needs to be. Trying to put it in the health and safety space is not where it needs to be. It needs to fit firmly, as Jason said just now, within strategy. You know, if we have a strategy about organisational resiliency, then our resiliency of our workplace needs to actually work with our strategy around sustainability. The other thing that's happening, I think, a lot in this space from a psychological point of view, which is I'm an organisational psychologist, so I have that sort of headset in the things I'm talking about, is most of the work you see on resilience of staff is actually about the individual. But whether or not we're resilient, there's a certain amount that's our responsibility, but there's also a lot that's about the culture in which we work. So Jason and I might be incredibly resilient, but put us in a toxic team environment, put us in a difficult culture, put us with the leader from hell, and all of a sudden, guess what? We're not resilient anymore. And in my coaching work at the moment, I'm seeing incredibly competent people in trouble. And you can't say that they weren't resilient, it's just that the toolkit that they're using in the current situation is not working. So the toxic environment or whatever it is overtaking. So what have we been doing? Well, we've developed a scale called the Resilience at Work scale that is 7 factors that you need to invest in order to be resilient. And we developed that in about 2012, I think, and that's actually being used internationally in research and internationally in applications at the moment. But what we found was, as I said earlier, that we can invest in ourselves individually, but we also need to invest in the team. So we've also developed a scale called the Raw 7, which actually looks at elements that we need to invest in at a team level. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to take the qualities from the 100 resilient cities that I showed earlier on when we did the introduction, and I'm going to look at what do they look like if you apply them to a team. Because I think so much of the work in my area is actually around the individual. And what I'll invite you to do is on your tables there's some stickies, and what would be really good is in any of these areas, if you think of an idea or you've had an idea that worked, to write that idea on the sticky. So what's the first quality? Well, we actually know that if we are a resilient team, we have to be robust. So what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, as the lady here from SA Health said, we need to have a shared purpose. And what we've actually found in our work is that the more difficult the work and the more the changing landscape happening around you, the more important purpose becomes. And particularly for you as public servants, because I absolutely agree with what Irma said this morning, that people come to the public service because they are passionate. They are passionate about their community. They do want to give back. But if they feel they're not adding value and that purpose is disappearing, then people will quickly start to lose their resilience. If you're in Families SA and you're in child protection, unless you believe in the safety of the child, there's no way that you will be able to manage all the media publicity that's had about that organisation. So purpose is a fundamental factor. Goals, strategy, alignment with all those things. So we still know that to be a resilient team, we have to tick off Teamwork 101. We have to be clear on what we're doing. We have to be clear on our strategy. We have to have good relationships. So what I'm going to do is, for each of these elements, I'm actually going to share my observations of the public sector here. I have the great privilege of working with a lot of different agencies at all different levels, up to CEOs. So I get to hear uncensored, I guess, struggles that senior leaders have in my coaching work. I get to work with phenomenal teams, and I get to work with teams in trouble. And so what I'm going to share is my observations. You might not agree with them, but I want you to think of this as a challenge rather than a criticism, because my role is to support people in doing these things rather than annihilate them. So what's getting in the way with robust teams then? So we know we need to invest in this team being really solid. Well, these are my observations that are happening. So we seem to be having a lot of changing leadership at the top. And what we need to be really careful of is when we bring in someone, you know, with new ideas from a different country or a different area, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so just as a little anecdote, a friend of mine who's a very senior person in her organisation, but with a couple of layers above her, was saying to me, I've actually stopped reading the, you know, who's leaving notices, because if I start to think any more about the changing landscape above me, I'm going to not be able to do my job. My job hasn't changed. I'm still doing exactly the same service delivery. So it's interesting, she was disengaging with what was going on at the top. And that's the last thing we want, is strategy actually not being meshed with operational things going on. So we need to get purpose there. We need to make sure it's clear. In Safe Work SA, I've been working there recently. One of the guys said, I feel schizophrenic. He said, one day I'm going out and educating an employer, the next day I'm going out and slapping a fine on them for, so in Families to say, are we about reunification? Are we actually about regulation? So even though the purpose around the community and the public service is there, being really clear on what actually is that purpose and how we align with that. And how do we make sure everyone's aligned with that? And as I said, the more difficult the job, the more purpose actually becomes so important. And I'm seeing a lot of professional people, particularly in the government, who are actually saying, I don't feel I add value anymore. I feel my professional standards are being compromised. And so it's really, really difficult to work in this space. Someone the other day said to me, it's the end for me. I've just been asked to write a brief of a brief. I have no sense anymore. This is a very senior person. I have no sense anymore of how I add value. So that's a really fundamental thing that we need to be thinking about. Yes, changing leadership's good, but how we make sure that actually doesn't create so much uncertainty. There's so much change in purpose and direction that actually working against us. The next element, and I guess this is about the innovation part that Jason talked about with the principles earlier on. One of the things we've found in our research, and what I've been fascinated about, is looking at an organisation and looking at why are you thriving and why are you in trouble with the same set of challenges. What's the difference? And one of the things we know is really important is optimising the resources that you've actually had. And so one of the people this morning spoke about the woman from Premier and Cabinet, forgotten the name, sorry, who talked about being able to deliver the platform with no budget. So how do we know we're not going to get any more staff. And I mean, in this lady's from SA Health, the last thing you say in SA Health is you need more money, because you'll be like, all you hear is the mantra about how much, overrun the budget already is. So what we're seeing is resilient teams are very good at optimizing what they have. And whether that's in a hospital, it might be an hour by hour regroup around, what's coming in and triaging, etc. Or whether it's actually a weekly regroup on this has happened and we need to reorient our resources, or whether it's actually how are we better using the strengths and what we've got. There's a million variations of things that you can actually do to optimise your resources. So think about that. Are there any ideas, any strategies? What are some of the things you can put on your stickies that are actually things that have worked for you in terms of being really resourceful in your teams? You know, we see, particularly the teams that work in communities, and particularly our country teams, you know, they're very, very adept at being resourceful because they're not usually able to access some of the strategies. And yet what do? We try to bring in consistent practices that, you know, you have to be aligned with, you know, with the metro area. And I know any of you from the country will know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of lamenting, you know, how something that might be innovative and resourceful has got to actually line up with consistent practice. What gets in the way, and again, these are my observations. Why is that lost again? I'm not doing very well on my slides today. I have to go back to my notes. What gets in the way of resourcefulness is, guess what? Risk aversion. So our B-man, Mark, wasn't that a great little session about risk? So what we tend to do is we tend to be so caught up in the management of the risk that we're actually not focused on outcomes. And the classic ones here are HR complaint processes. The amount of money I've seen tied up with, you know, processes that are actually to do with staffing performance is extraordinary, and it becomes about the process, not the outcome. And so we can waste an enormous amount of money in that area. So the process versus the outcome. And I guess, you know, the guy who said, you know, lamenting the risk of writing the brief of a brief, you know, where is the outcome in that? So how many of you would quite willingly say that there is quite a lot of processes in your organisation that you have to navigate? And one of the things that Irma was talking about earlier on, of course, was actually trying to get some consistency and some practice around that so it doesn't become all about process rather than about outcome. So risk aversion is definitely something that's highly problematic. Right, so the next one's redundancy, and this is one that I'm really not sure how you go about this in the public sector, because what they say in the 100 Resilient Cities quality is that what we need to be doing is we need to be building some redundancy into our, if we translate it to the workforce, into our workforce, so when things go wrong, we actually have some capacity to actually do something about that. But I think the most common complaint I hear from managers is, I've actually got to manage all this change or disruption and still do my regular job. So redundancy is very much around how do we have that little bit of capacity to be able to do something additional. It also relates to the resourcefulness. I work with a very senior ex-state government CEO who's now moved to the private sector, in a not-for-profit organisation, and it's very interesting that they're actually building in part of the budget and part of the staffing, which is about innovation. So rather than it seeing something you've got to fit around everything else or change fitting around something else, he was very firm with his board around, what's my budget for this? What are you going to actually do to give me some stuff, which is actually in addition to the operational budget? But of course, mostly in your environment, you're really struggling with that. So what gets in the way? Well, overload, just sheer overload. I mean, how many of you here are doing a full-time job and managing a change of some description? And no buffer. And the other emerging trend I think is happening here, which is a bit of a worrying trend, is that because we have no buffer in our teams, if one person's unwell, maybe they've got maybe there's some mental health issue happening, whether there's a physical issue happening, that there's no buffer to manage that. And what I'm starting to see creeping in is people actually starting to be less forgiving and more resentful when people are actually not totally 110% all of the time. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but the redundancy is certainly one of the principles I think that the government in general are struggling with. But maybe it's the question of what are we busy with? And you know, it's really interesting. You can't say, how are you? You say, how are you, busy? And it's sort of like you have no option other than to be busy, because if you're not pulling your weight, or you're not competent, or in our case, we're no good, because if we're not busy, we're useless consultants. So, so you have this whole busyness stuff that sits on top of that that's very interesting, but it's busy doing what, I think, and there's probably not enough challenging of what people are doing and whether it's adding value or whether it's just another layer of process. My favourite resilient person in the world is Mr. Bean. One of the principles that Mr. Bean embodies is flexibility. So that's another principle, and I guess it's agility, using the language that Jason used earlier on. But resilient teams are flexible in terms of how they approach things. So they're able to be agile enough to shift the way they actually do things, to be flexible in their thinking, to be flexible in their approach. And of course, a lot of this is led by leadership. So if we have someone who's very structured, very black and white, then the capacity for flexibility is very much compromised. But this is what gets in the way. Sense of entitlement. It's about me, not about what I'm employed to do. And one of my favourite questions is, who do you exist to serve? And I've been I do a lot of facilitation, so I facilitated a strategic risk workshop with the senior people of one agency a while ago. And they came up with all these strategic risks, and someone at the end of it said, the client's not mentioned. And someone said, don't worry, we'll rewrite it because it's all about the client. But it was very interesting that a lot of the conversations you can have in your organisations, the client might not be even mentioned, whether it's the patient in health, or whether it's the child in families SA, or whether it's the internal customer in DTF, for example. So a sense of entitlement. I think we still have a core of people in the government, and this is local government as well, who have a great sense of entitlement around this being about me. So we also need to be working on how we start to break that down. And I certainly, in my coaching work, have a couple of people at the moment who are working on how do I break down a sense of entitlement in the team in which I lead. Centralised decision making, of course, is always a real factor in flexibility. And my son's at Bond Uni, and we had the graduation recently, and I was talking to some of the professors about agility and organisations that were seen as think tanks. And we were talking about how once think tanks got to a certain size, they then became a bureaucracy, and so they weren't a think tank anymore. So we've known for generations that centralised decision making doesn't work, and yet what do we do in government? We constantly actually share this, I'm not knocking shared services here, but we're constantly looking at centralised ways of doing things, whereas flexibility is very much around what we're doing on the ground. In flexible thinking styles, one of the areas this plays out is that we need to be making sure we recruit leaders who can think conceptually, because we're dealing with complexity now. So if we have someone who's very black and white and very inflexible in their thinking, and certainly I've worked with one organisation where there was a woman who was in charge of 80 people in a really busy department, and she was so black and white and concrete thinking, I wanted to shoot her, let alone the staff. And there was no way you can shift that. It's in her DNA. So no amount of coaching or whatever was going to change that person. So we can't, she'd been there a long time and she'd done her dues, and that's okay. But we can't be recruiting managers into these positions. We really need to be looking at leadership. So we can very easily say, oh, look, Jessica and Jill, you need to be more, less change resistant. Which is a classic inflexibility. But what we need to be doing is we need to be constantly actually creating environments where we're leading and doing that place. I remember one team I was working with, they had to actually just change locations, and 2 of them resigned because they just couldn't. All these are government examples, because they couldn't cope with a different office location. You might laugh, say those their problem. They were IT, mind you, but you might laugh and say, oh, okay, but Those people hadn't had to change their job for about 15 years. So how can you suddenly call someone change resistant when you weren't in an environment of continuous improvement to start with? It's really, you know, it's not fair, it's not reasonable, I don't think. Detailed job descriptions, don't get me on those. It's a bit like the, I loved Marx, you know, you build the fortress because one person does the wrong thing. That's what happens with job descriptions, you know. They don't do it, so we'll nail them and write every single task they need to do. It's totally against flexibility. We want something that's open and easily shared. And of course, job demarcation. Inclusiveness. Really interesting aspect of the research we've just done on team resilience was we actually found that feeling cared about and connected to your team was really important. So if you feel like a function, not a person, then that sense of belonging, that sense of inclusiveness absolutely rocks your resilience. And so within their 100 resilient cities, they're talking about inclusiveness as being around decision making. But if you don't feel you belong on a personal level, then you're probably unlikely to feel that you actually belong in an organisational level in terms of decision making. So what do resilient teams do? They're very inclusive of their members, and they do care about them as people, and they do make sure there's self-care. So in the government, you have all these flexible processes, but what people will tell you is what that looks like depends on the manager. You know, whether the manager. And another example, I've got hundreds. By the way, my new book's come out, and it's got lots of case studies in it, and it's already sold out because it's a bit like Jackie Collins, because my friends have been wanting to find out if they're in it. But another example is a woman who worked in a fairly fast-paced environment, end of career, well, you know, sort of maybe not end of career these days, but early 60s. And we were having a team development day, and she turned to her manager and said, "Thank you." She said, "You're the first manager I've ever had who thought I had a personal life." You know, so it's very interesting in terms of that. So inclusiveness, what gets in the way? Well, self-interest. I've done mediations which have been with directors, and because it's not been resolvable, they've restructured the departments. So it's not been functionally useful at all. It's actually been around conflicts, egos. And my favourite saying is anything's possible if no one wants to take the credit. But particularly as we move up organisations, the ego struggles, etc., can get in the way. And of course, directive leadership works against inclusiveness. I hope you're not going to tell anyone any of these things I'm telling you today. A bit like secret lives. And the very last one is one that Jason's talked a lot about, and was an interesting one in terms of what Nadia was talking about today when she was talking about, well, you know, they're working on healthy workers, and of course, you know, healthy workers doesn't help the bottom line. It's very much around, you know, we're wanting optimal performance. But the other thing she talked about, which relates to the integration, is the importance of actually working in an interagency way and actually gaining buy-in. And that's one of the things I think the Health and All Policies unit does really well. With absolutely zero official influence, they're able to actually get interagency buy-in on a whole range of things, which is absolutely fantastic. So what does integration mean? Well, it's actually about integrating your resources to get more than you would have on your own, obviously. And we found in our research that the capacity to capability build is incredibly important. And because capability building isn't funded for us, we need to be actually looking at how we build capability externally. So how each of our people network, you know, so we have our individual networks and our team networks are linking into support. And some of the best managers I've worked with in the government have been those who've linked themselves into every imaginable network that they need, not strategically, not just going out for lunch and coffees, and support they need, but they've also done that for their team. So incredible capability building through integration with other resources. I worked briefly in the Lama Kewen Hospital some time ago, just on a part-time basis, and I was fascinated how the reinvention of lots of things and stuff was happening in the different other areas that no one else knew about. I think there's still lots of scope for integration of some of the brilliant stuff that's going on that just doesn't get heard about generally. So what gets in the way? Silos, and Jason's actually absolutely true around the silo stuff in that we need to have very solid silos because that's the robust stuff. That's actually about we need to feel we have a solid purpose, we have solid teamwork, etc. But what we need to be doing is making sure the connections are there, not just one connection like on the slides, but a variety of connections across it so that people are actually working together. And I think the only way we get teams working together is if there's a shared goal. You know, it's no good just saying, oh, we want you to network. But if you've got a similar goal like the 90-day projects, I guess, it works. And the other thing that gets in the way, of course, is competition for the resources. So picking on health again, I know people from health who don't like to go to budget meetings because no one likes them, because health is seen as pinching all the money. You know, so you almost feel sort of like you shouldn't be at the table. So this competition for resources, rather than looking at what are our big, hairy, complex issues that we all need to be working together on. And of course, that goes right through the organisation, doesn't it, that competition? Reflective, I think this is the last one. So one of the principles of the resilient cities is to be resilient, we need to be able to learn from the past and reflect. And I see reflective practice almost disappearing. So what are the ways in your team you build reflection? Every time you do a project, do you look at what worked well and what didn't, or are you straight on to the next one? Every time you do something different in your practices, are you reflecting on that? Are you sharing it? What is the mechanism that you do that individually and do you do that collectively? And I really do think that's missing, and certainly on a group basis, but also I think it's being lost on an individual basis because we're running. So what gets in the way? This busyness. Busyness, it seems to sit on top of everything. Too many things to do and not enough time to actually do them. All right, so what I get you to do now is to, just on your tables, you've all got a, I've given you one of those elements. Just on your table to just reflect on what are a couple of ideas that you have that might fit with that element. So for example, these guys here have got redundancy. So what are a couple of very simple things that you could put in place in your team, and I want you to think about team level, that could actually build a sense of redundancy for them or flexibility or whatever you've actually got. So just a couple of minutes just to have a quick conversation on that. So what we'll do is we'll just get one or two because we need to transition next door in a moment, and I understand it's not a full afternoon tea break, it's a sort of grab a coffee and transition through type of break. So just to get a flavour, just maybe one or two ideas that came up on the table. Anyone want to share? And you're going to share the mic. Anyone willing to?
Yeah, we had the importance of, I guess, of being integrated, so bringing together teams to catalyse additional benefits and resources. So I guess that was similar to our previous conversation, saying that you actually just need to have a higher level of purpose, so that people actually can see beyond their teams. Yes. But then we had a bit of a conversation because I think anecdotally and practically you can actually, collaborate. So we can take some responsibility and we can, work well together when it's possible. Mm-hmm. I think one of the issues that a couple of us were talking about, though, is if we actually want to get a critical mass, and I guess there's major challenges facing this state, whether child protection or health or whatever, to actually get a critical mass and then mobilise on a bigger level to actually make multiple changes. That's when I think, the sense of purpose is just so important. But we can manage on a day-to-day and collaborate with our colleagues. But to actually make a big, big difference, yes, we actually need the whole system to be a bit more collaborative.
Yes, and I agree. And I think, Belinda was talking about change is sort of incremental and opportunistic. And we can do that absolutely at our team level. But we also need strategies more broadly around how we actually building this integrated. So if there's some process, without being too much process oriented, there's some structure to do that, it's more likely to happen. So I'm always interested when I do organisational change work is what do we need individuals to do, what do we need teams to do, and what structures or processes do we need to support that. And unless you get those three things lined up, it's less likely to have impact. I think I might have gone over time, have I? So maybe one very quick idea, and then we might need to close off and move forward. Anyone else? There's a lot of discussion, but probably coffee is looking a bit more appetising. So thanks very much to my colleague, to Jason, and thanks for coming, and hope you enjoyed it.